Hello and welcome to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kausji. Niaga Spotlight takes us through the week in economic analysis and future affairs. Today on Future Affairs, our spotlight is on International Women's Day, IWD 2026, and on the global IWD theme of rights, justice, action for all women and girls, focusing this time on financial violence. Now, studies indicate that more than 50% of all reported domestic violence cases in Malaysia involve financial violence. Financial violence is a form of domestic abuse characterized by the control, sabotage, or exploitation of a person's financial resources. Now, while Malaysia's Domestic Violence Act 1994 recognizes and can compensate economic harm caused by abuse, financial abuse or violence is not listed as a distinct form of abuse. So, with financial violence being one of the least visible forms of domestic abuse, it is often the mechanism that traps victims in harmful relationships. So, to go a little bit deeper into this and take an innovative approach, today on Niaga Spotlight, we look at Islamic finance principles and how Islamic financial institutions, or FIs, can play an ethical role in addressing financial violence and reducing its impact and occurrence. Joining me to explore this are Professor Dr. Aishat Muniza, Senior Islamic Financial Advisor with the UNFPA in Malaysia, Ratna Shaira Kamaluddin, who is Executive Director with IBIM, and Ashraf Goma Ali, Chief Sharia and Sustainability Officer, MBSB Berhad, joining us online. A very good morning to all of you, especially Prof. Aishat as well as Puan Ratna and Encik Ashraf joining us online. So, to perhaps get the discussion started, Prof. Aishat, let's look at firstly Islamic finance, ethics and Sharia governance, and looking at Islamic ethics together with harm reduction. So perhaps from a Maqasid al-Sharia lens, allow us to please situate this entire discussion from this viewpoint.
Thank you very much for that great question. Now, if we look at financial coercion from a Maqasid al-Sharia perspective, we understand that it's a clear violation of at least two core objectives.
Right.
Now, the two core objectives which we are talking about is number one, when it comes to protection of wealth, Islam gives paramount consideration to protection of wealth. And then the next one is protection of dignity. So we understand that these two core principles are violated when it comes to financial coercion. Now, imagine a situation, a person is forced into debt, or they are denied given that under the circumstances they are not given their salary, or they are prevented from working, or even their assets are controlled by another.
That's right.
So definitely these are the instances in which a harm is caused to another. From an Islamic jurisprudential perspective, if we look at it, harm must not only be avoided in Islam, but it must be clearly eliminated. Now, if we look at some of the other jurisdictions, we understand that in the UK, for instance, when it comes to economic abuse, it has been clearly put in the legislation what it means. And there are NGOs who are working with financial institutions to ensure that a safe environment is created when it comes to economic abuse. Same thing goes to Australia. For example, the banking sector adopted a family violence code of practice, which means that irrespective of the bank you enter, uniformly people are treated in that sense. And when it comes to ethics and Islamic finance, we can't stop by saying that Islamic finance is ethical, because ethics must be operational as well.
Right, not just as a principle, but also in action too.
Yes. So it's important for us to understand at this point, for Islamic finance, what does this imply? So if we are talking about the role of Sharia committees or Sharia boards should treat financial coercion as a governance issue. So likewise, when we design the products, we have to design it by considering the power imbalance risk, and harm reduction must be embedded in systems, and it shouldn't be left for individual whims.
Exactly.
And we also believe that in Islam, justice is something which should be practical. It can't be theoretical. So in that case, we have to practice what we preach, and justice should prevail in all circumstances, and Islamic financial institutions should practice wherever it can to provide justice to whoever comes to them in the forms of consumers or customers.
Exactly, which is, I think, a really important juncture at which we are able to connect domestic violence, financial violence, and also to the fact that it is most often quite invisibilized. Issues which are happening within a domestic sphere, for example, such as coercion or preventing a woman or a wife from working or even from accessing funds in a joint bank account, those may not be relevant or visible on a public level. But at the same time, I think it brings up the opportunity for us to look about, especially at industry standards as well. That brings me to Puan Ratna. So in Malaysia, Puan Ratna, we also have statistics from different women's rights organizations which are showing that, yes, while this is a global issue that points to every 1 in 3 women experiencing some kind of economic coercion, which classifies as financial violence, we also see financial abuse appearing in anywhere up to 80% of the cases of domestic violence. So there is a clear correlation. And at the same time, what are your perspectives on the banking industry moving towards some shared minimum standards which can help to acknowledge this from both a humanitarian as well as an Islamic finance best perspective?
Okay, thank you, Thamina. So basically, from the banking industry perspective, moving toward this minimum shared standard for responding to financial abuse disclosure is a very, it makes a lot of sense, both ethically and operationally. And why this matters, why this common protocol matters, I can summarize to 3. That is, first, for consistency of care,
Right.
where customers experience financial abuse should not face uncertainty, depending on which banks or which branch that they approach. So a shared protocol ensures fairness and predictability. So basically, for the victim, I can call them victim, right?
That's right.
When they go to the bank, they must feel that there is a consistency. Whether they go to Bank A or Bank B or different branches.
No
the
fear of
treatment-
being turned away, for
Yes,
example.
So
Right.
that is one. Another one is on trust and reputation. The banks are considered the custodians for financial security, especially when the victim is an account holder of that particular bank. To demonstrate a unified, compassionate response is very important because it strengthens the public trust and position the industry as a responsible partner in the social issue, because not many of the victims, have this strength, or they are empowered to go and tell the bank that, look, I need help, I'm in distress. And normally they'll just keep quiet. And they don't go to the bank. So, and the third one is for the risk management. The financial abuse often overlaps with fraud, coercion, or unauthorized transactions. So a common standard will help banks to detect and mitigate the risk more effectively.
Exactly, because fraud, coercion are also other financial violations which
Yes.
definitely happen outside of a domestic violence and financial violence scenario. So banks do already have a very straightforward protocol for this, right?
Yes, the banks do have the straight a framework on this, or an SOP.
Yes.
Of course, after the Bank Negara Malaysia's fair treatment of financial consumers is out, then the banks have the regulations are set, and the banks are expected to work on this.
Yes.
And they already have their complaint management systems, they have their legal and compliance review processes, as well as they already have their existing hardship framework. Only that when you talk about domestic violence or financial violence, of course, there is no specific SOP
As of now.
yeah. For this financial abuse. So it's being treated basically under the same framework for the hardship for other vulnerable community as well. Yes.
So that's actually very heartening because it shows that at least as financial institutions, the process can already move forward without having to wait for any standalone legislation.
Yes.
Thank you, Puan Ratna. Now, moving into Che Ashraf from MBSB Bank, who is joining us online. Now, looking at a Sharia and sustainability perspective, Ashraf, financial responsibility, let's frame it from the lens of amana instead of, let's say, ownership. Now, Islamic law is also clear that a married woman retains full ownership over income, assets, and her legal and financial identity remains rather distinct. Yet, however, culturally, financial responsibility can sometimes be framed as a part of household leadership. So from a Sharia governance perspective, how could we understand financial responsibility within marriage then? If you would be able to explain to us a little more.
Okay, thank you so much. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu salam ala Rasulillah. So when we talk about amana, I want to take a step back and speak about sort of the philosophical basis of it, and then we'll touch on your question. As Malaysians, right, in Malaysia, the first rukun nagara is belief in God. And what's interesting about that is that if you believe in God, then that means all of us are God's creation. And if we're all God's creation, then it's a sacred trust. How we treat each other is a sacred trust. All of the resources that we have are also a sacred trust, right? So now the concept of amana is something that it's a sacred trust that we'll be asked about. Now, when it comes to women in a marriage, it's very clear in Sharia that her money is her money, and that the husband does not have the right to transgress on her money. That's number one. And he will be asked about that transgression on the Day of Judgment if he does transgress. Now, the second issue is that when it comes to managing the family, that issue in many cases is done jointly, but with the leadership of the husband. The joint nature of it is such that the woman can voluntarily spend on the family. And this is kind of the perspective in Sharia. And if she does that, she retains ownership, and her spending is an act of voluntary charity. Right? And that's something that's important for the husband to recognize and to appreciate. Because if that is not appreciated, and not recognized, it's effectively a type of injustice, to the wife. So it is her money, and if she wants to contribute to the family, she can contribute independently, right? And leadership within the family is an amana. It's a responsibility to protect and support the well-being of the family, and doesn't imply that the husband can control her money. So from a banking perspective, this principle is reflected in ensuring that individuals have access to the financial services independently, including homemakers who might not be formally employed. They can have their own accounts and they can control without interference from anyone else. So all in all, financial responsibility in Islam is measured by justice, care, and the prevention of harm. It's not about control.
Exactly. So clearly the assets of the woman, they do remain her own independently, and responsibility cannot be used to justify any form of control. Thanks for the perspective and anchoring in that, Che Ashraf. Moving back to Prof. Aishat. Now let's focus a little bit of looking at the legal relief perspective and also looking at the real world scenario within which, of course, we all operate. Now, we do have a Domestic Violence Act in Malaysia, which does provide some avenues such as compensation for financial loss, which may arise from any domestic violence. But at the same time, so many of the survivors are struggling to access remedies in practice. Coming from your viewpoint, Prof. Aishat, what are some of these last mile sort of barriers which women and domestic violence survivors and victims are encountering time after time, which, if we are able to use the Islamic finance lens, actually can prove to be smoothed over very efficiently?
I think I would say the biggest barriers are not legal but practical.
Okay.
For example, if we take one instance, it's very hard to prove economic abuse because documentation is not an easy thing to obtain. And when you go to a competent court of law to prove your case, how do you prove it without proper documentation? Let's assume that somebody forcefully took your salary and it's taken in cash. There's no paper trail, right? And then let's assume that somebody is taking possession over your properties, but you don't have any proof to show to the court. So in that case, lack of documentation is a practical problem we face right now. Another issue I would say is lack of access control. So what I mean by that is, of course, nowadays we have so many security features embedded in the banking products as well. For example, you have to get an OTP.
Sure,
You have to
because
have
everything
your
is digital
own-
finance.
Yes,
Yeah.
on SIM, and then you have to get an authentication code. But what if all these things are controlled by the perpetrator or the abuser? So in that instance, whatever the comforts given to you in paper has little or no relevance at all. You can say that you are protected, but actually you are more exposed to danger. And the last problem I would want to highlight would be the fear of retaliation. Now, if someone has the strength to go and report or take action against the perpetrator or the abuser, what would be the fear in the mind of such a victim or the survivor? Of course, the escalation of retaliation or taking some kind of action to further make the position of the survivor or the victim much more weaker is something which they foresee. So because of that, people sometimes tend to say it's better to be or maintain the status quo rather than take any action forward to become more empowered and to go against the perpetrator or the abuser. So what I believe is that we do have enough legal remedies available, but the question is, how do we use them in a practical manner, and do we have enough resources available to victims or the survivors to empower them in the situations in which they are in?
Exactly. So everything which Prof. Aishat has mentioned, I feel Puan Ratna now is a perfect segue into you helping us to dig a little bit deeper into what you had earlier briefly touched upon, which is Bank Negara Malaysia's, the FTFC policy for vulnerable customers. So when it comes to that, from IBIM's perspective, what could be a few, maybe top 2 or top 3 operational practices in bank processes which may help to illuminate some of the financial violence issues which the victims and survivors may be facing?
I'd see that, well, the framework is already in place in the banking industry, not just the Islamic banks, but
Overall,
yes. Yeah. And it sets a very clear expectation in that policy itself. So the framework is in place. So it's now about making responses consistent across all banks. It comes back to the first one, that you go to any banks, you'll get the same treatment. And the opportunity for us now is to harmonize certain principles across institutions so that vulnerable customers experience safety and respect. For this kind of victims, financial abuse victim or domestic violence victims, what they need is safety and for us to treat them respectfully, whichever bank they approach. Yeah. So I have like 3 quick operational,
Sure.
to share. From our engagement with our member banks, from IBIM's engagement with member banks, the 3 operational practices stand out as realistic for quick alignment, first is safer communication preferences. That's since the banks already have the technical capability to adjust correspondence channels and notifications. So this is, I think, the most low-hanging thing that
Step
they can.
one, the basic, when to contact somebody, perhaps how to contact someone.
Yeah, because they need some discrete treatment for this. So industry alignment will ensure that these adjustments are handled discreetly and securely when vulnerability is disclosed. Secondly is clarity around escalation. How when the customer comes to the branch, how do the staff takes it to escalate the matter?
Yeah.
So coordination can reinforce that each institution has clearly defined pathway for handling vulnerable case. And while internal mechanics differ from banks to banks, but the principle of clarity ensures that the frontline staff, they know what to do next. They are never uncertain of the next steps. Okay, so
in that sense, they don't leave the victim alone or hanging on the line.
So they know, where to take
action.
And the third is on minimizing repeated disclosure. This is very important, Tamina, because customers should not have to retell their stories every time they go to the bank unnecessarily. So shared learning on the confidentiality safeguards can reduce re-traumatization and strengthen trust. So we must understand that this is not about uniformity. This is about alignment across the institutions, and this tree does not require new legislation. Basically, the framework is already at the institutions. They can just enhance it or put more processes, or not processes. What I mean is put more understand how to simplify and make it better to attend to this customer.
And ensure also every customer who may be approaching with perhaps financial violence or any fraud-related mechanisms immediately gets attended to.
Yes. So basically they have to give some hints or, show some clue to the officers so that they can attend to.
Exactly. So some basic SOPs in place. Thank you for that, Puan Ratna. We take a quick break now. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with the rest of this discussion on International Women's Day and connecting it to financial violence.
Ada yang perdebatan bahawa GST perlu dikembalikan semula kerana ada yang mempertikaikan bahawa SST itu tidak efektif.
Isu buruh kanak-kanak bukan sahaja dalam bentuk fizikal tetapi juga bentuk moden yang lebih licik dan juga terselindung.
Kita tengok buruh kanak-kanak dan ada juga buruh paksa kanak-kanak.
Kumpulan FB dikenali sebagai grup budak-budak sekolah rendah yang didakwa menyebarkan gambar remaja perempuan tidak senonoh telah pun ditutup.
Racism in Malaysia is not just a social issue, it is deeply entrenched in our institutions and our policy making.
How come every other time there is something that is triggering?
Whenever there is a heavy vehicle collision or a fatality involving heavy vehicles, public frustration often zeroes in on the driver, the lorry driver.
I mean, that's the easiest.
Typical pajak business model.
Welcome back to Niaga Spotlight. Still with me, Tamina Kausji. Now for IWD 2026, our focus is on addressing financial violence. Online, we have rejoining us, Sheikh Ashraf from MBSB Berhad. Ashraf, so now moving into another area of discussion, looking at maintenance, nafkah, as well as the spirit of justice. So now under Malaysia's Islamic family law frameworks, maintenance is an obligation according to means, but Sharia also emphasizes justice, compassion, and also prevention of harm. How ought we to understand the spirit behind nafkah? If you could help to explain it to us in a way that can be easily understood.
About nafaqah. And nafaqah is a fundamental obligation in Islamic law. And it's the foundation of how the family works. You can say the gender roles. the husband is responsible to spend on the wife and provide for her, and the wife is not responsible to do that, right? As I touched on earlier. And interestingly enough, there was a famous book, by Elizabeth Warren, one of the people who was in Congress in the U.S., called The Two-Income Trap. And in the book, she basically speaks about in the past, when it used to be the traditional family structure, the woman's income was always served as a safety net, as a backup. And because of that, in those times, bankruptcies were much lower. But when you have two incomes and both parties are equally responsible to take care of the household, what ends up happening is the spending increases, and if there's any shake in the financial situation of either party, then it could lead to bankruptcy. So the Islamic perspective of the husband is responsible to take care of the family, and the wife's contribution is voluntary. Itself is a form of facilitates stability. Now the issue is that the role of banks is to try to facilitate that, right? Because whenever there is financial problems in the household, that can be something that can, cause destruction of the family, destruction of the marriage. It can affect the children's well-being and things of that nature. So this is where the responsibility of banks, and I can speak, from our own bank, we are focusing on not causing people to be unnecessarily in debt. So we focus on how to help people build their wealth, how to help people own their own home, how to help people get a better education, things that can strengthen the resilience of the family. So there is the importance of dignity, and as Prof. Aisha mentioned, this is one of the key maqasid of Sharia. And there's also the issue of preservation of wealth, which is also one of the maqasid of Sharia, and not just preservation of wealth of the individual. And this is important because this is where each individual has their own financial independence, but also the wealth of the family in a prudent and stable way. So I hope that clarifies this particular issue.
Yes, thank you. Because also overall, when we do look at it, outside of individual households, this is also about overall household resilience, which does also impact, of course, the safety and the social structure of an entire society. Thanks for that, Jay Ashraf. Moving back to Prof. Aishat. So perhaps if we can have a look at Sharia governances as a safeguard then. Now, Sharia committees, they typically assess, let's say, product compliances. But financial violence, of course, as we understand now, is often enabled through how accounts and facilities are controlled in real life. What might it look like, Prof. Aisha, to embed survivor safety and also economic agency considerations when we're looking at Sharia governance, with, of course, trying to minimize the role of banks as having to behave as investigators, but just building it into the framework already?
I think first I have to clarify that the role of Sharia committee is not to investigate the households.
That's right.
Definitely. But what we need to understand is that we need to expand the oversight functions of Sharia committee from merely looking at the product validity perspective to execution impact perspective. Now, when it comes to financial harm, we understand that sometimes people have this misconception that the financial harm can arise from the structure of the products. But it's not the truth, because it depends on how it is controlled.
The user is also, of course, part of the overall experience.
Yes. So it's not about the product compliance that we are so much worried about. It's not the product structure per se, but we need to understand how it is controlled. So having said that, when we try to embed survivor safety through Sharia committee's role, it may include three things.
Okay.
Number one is reviewing whether joint accounts allow unilateral control. Number two, assessing whether financing structures create lock-in risks. And the final point is requiring vulnerability impact considerations during product approval stage. So what we try to achieve by doing this is, of course, adl or justice, and we want to eliminate harm as well. But what we understand is that when it comes to economic agency must be part of its oversight function. It can't be like ad hocly saying that we are concerned only on one part, not the other. Now, I think at this stage the probing question would be, does this turn banks into investigators? So for me, I don't think so, because it turns governance into safeguard. And it will definitely strengthen Islamic finance credibility, not only locally, but internationally as well.
Exactly. And I'd like to just pick up on the first point that you mentioned, which is quite often joint accounts, do they allow for unilateral access? So that, of course, would be a huge gap that actually can be addressed very swiftly just by internal bank protocols that, of course, align across the entire financial system. Because these small tweaks or just having the lens allows financial institutions to take a more proactive role, because we are already aware that domestic violence quite often is either even caused or exacerbated by the financial aspect of it, right? Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you for that. Puan Ratna, from IPIN's perspective, so now let's dig one step further, looking at data and what can and should be tracked, but of course within the parameters of customer safety. So that's going to be very important, because if the banking industry is willing to come on board to prevent coerced debt, financial entrapment as well, what kinds of non-invasive, privacy-safe indicators can we be looking for?
Okay, it's interesting because the data, it can protect or it can expose.
Exactly.
So we must focus on safe and aggregated indicators, and in this case, especially in the financial abuse cases, this has to be handled with extreme care. Talking about how banks can track, right, to ensure to mitigate this entrapment. It's not that easy unless the customers come to the bank and really speak and say that
so the first step still lies within the hands of the customer, right?
Yes. Of course, after that, because just by tracking, the personal loan, the personal financing, looking at how the payment, it cannot really say that a particular borrower is being coerced.
Payment cycles may change due to a vast number of reasons.
Yes.
So banks cannot, in that sense, be flagging each and every inconsistent, so to say, withdrawal.
Many times, the awareness that we are not supposed to share our personal banking information.
Right.
But of course, in this case, it's different. They've been forced to provide whatever passwords or cards to the other party. But then again, that's why, your questions, how I said just now, the importance of the bank to ensure a safe environment so that the customers trust and be able to come forward and speak to tell the banks that, hey, look, I need help, help me on this. Unless they do that, it's not easy for the banks to actually suddenly tell them, hey, look, your account, are you being, are you being forced to do this? It's not that easy to ask the customers on that. But what we can do is we can actually look into if there is anything, any domestic violence or financial violence customer that come forward, and we identify the customer, we can look into the trend and see how the banks actually address to them, what are the turnaround time from disclosure to action, and whether the mechanism in place is effective. Other than that, I think we should not unnecessarily request for personal information or this abuse stories, because it's not needed in the financial decision making. So
exactly.
banks, so in any way, the customers must must be able to trust the bank and to tell the bank her situation for the banks to take action on whatever account that they have. I'm sure the banks are ready to assist because we understand the vulnerability communities, and we need to attend to them accordingly.
And I think what's most promising is the ability for banks to harmonize a uniform response based on just a single alert, because that should already start a cascading process.
Yes.
And thank you very much for those perspectives. Moving back into asking NJ Ashraf, who's joining us online. Now, financial harm as a sustainability risk. Ashraf, if we can expand the lens. So now when families experience prolonged financial instability, whether through neglect of obligations or unequal control, the consequence can extend to, of course, children's education, housing security, also long-term poverty risk. From a sustainability and ethical finance standpoint, why should financial well-being within households also be framed as part of the broader social stability that Islamic finance does seek to uphold?
Thank you very much for that question. At MBSB, we have combined Sharia and sustainability. And so whenever we think about sustainability, we try to also think about it from a Sharia lens. And, I mentioned earlier about the Rukn Nagara. The first Rukn Nagara is belief in God. And if you look at the word sustainability, actually one of the names of God is Al-Qayyum, which is the sustainer, which seems to imply that if you want true sustainability, there must be an acknowledgement of God and the oversight of God in everything that we do. So I think this is one issue. I think the other issue, when we talk about Sharia and sustainability, is the importance of moral sustainability, morality, to have a sustainable society. It's not only looking after the environment, and it's not only looking after people's physical needs, but also the morality of the society is a key driver in true sustainability. And many philosophers say that the environmental crisis that we have is actually a moral crisis. It's the state of our hearts being reflected in the external environment. So with that, when we speak about the family, and also the family as a unit is not explicitly mentioned in the UN SDGs. But I think here in Nusantara, family is, of course, very important everywhere. So the stability of the family as a unit is key. In traditional Islamic ethics, when they speak about the management, they speak about management in three levels. The first is the management of the self, and the second is the management of the family, and the third is the management of the society. And each one requires the previous level. You have to have strong individuals who are moral, and then the second, you need to have family units that are resilient and strong and moral, and then that will help you to achieve a moral society. So coming back then to your question about the stability of the family unit, it's very important. You cannot have a functioning society, let alone a thriving society, without strong, resilient families. So this is definitely a sustainability issue. In MBSD, we were calling it the missing SDG, which is the issue of family resilience and stability. Not any product that we create should have a positive impact on family resilience and stability, and we should avoid any negative impact to family resilience and stability. So I think it speaks to this particular issue. I already touched earlier on the issue of unsustainable debt and burdening people with unsustainable debt. We need to avoid that in the financial sector, focusing on things that build people up, like first home financing, education financing, wealth building tools, saving tools, right? This is very important because typically when it comes to, abuse, in many cases, or in most cases, it goes back to a problem in the self of the abuser, right? It goes back to the issue of control, of a feeling of inadequacy, right? And sometimes these can be triggered by poor financial management, a person putting themselves in a bad situation, and then they do these types of things. So how can banks prevent that? Of course, many of the solutions have already been mentioned, and that's the benefit of me coming third after, two illustrious speakers. But also this issue of how can we help families become more financially resilient through savings and not getting themselves into bad financial situations that can then have these kind of ramifications. So ultimately, a financially stable family is the foundation of a stable society. And ethical finance, including Islamic finance, plays a central role in protecting that stability.
Thanks very much for that, Jay Ashraf, as well as our speakers, Apon Ratna, as well as Prof. Aishat. So overall, addressing financial violence clearly takes more than just awareness. It requires building greater safeguards within the financial system while reinforcing the principle that women's economic dignity is a right. When women have real financial security, families and ultimately a society is stronger for it. That's all we have time for today. See you next Friday with more economic analysis and insights. Here's to a productive week ahead.